Welcome, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Shirt, and I have the privilege of joining you as the new Managing Director of Globe Series. I'm thrilled that you could all join us today for this very special Globe virtual event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And I would invite you all now to take a moment to yourself, wherever you're joining from, to think about your connection to that place and acknowledge the people and communities that have welcomed you there and that came before you. On a personal note, it's thrilling to have just recently joined Globe, an organization that has decades of experience convening the right people around the right questions to get the solutions we need to drive action and build a better future. And one of the most critical questions right now is around the future of infrastructure, especially since it represents both an opportunity and a challenge as we transition towards a low carbon future. We're at a critical juncture. The decisions we make about infrastructure now could not only shore up short-term economic recovery efforts, but could also benefit future generations in a multitude of ways. And so with that in mind, we are so incredibly fortunate to be joined today by two people who are among Canada's most influential leaders on infrastructure. The Honourable Catherine McKenna, Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, and Michael Sabia, Chair of the Board of Canada Infrastructure Bank. On behalf of Globe and all of us tuning in today, thank you so much for being here to share your thoughts and your insights. And of course, without further ado, I'd love to turn things over to our moderator for today's conversation, another incredibly intelligent and bright individual joining us, Jennifer Keesmaat, CEO of the Keesmaat Group, and of course, former Chief City Planner, City of Toronto. Jennifer, Minister, Michael, over to you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Nothing really gets the heart pumping like a conversation about infrastructure. And in part, it's because for those of us who spend our lives and days thinking about the future and how to make the world a better place, we know that infrastructure is at the heart of our everyday lives in our country. And we're at this fascinating moment, of course, where we have this question about what an economic recovery looks like. And we know from the past that moments like this in history, whether it was after the Second World War or whether it has been after other recessions, that thinking carefully about how we invest and build infrastructure presents a profound opportunity to engage in nation building and city building. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have Minister McKenna as a part of this conversation and Mr. Sabia, who is new at the helm at the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, in order to have a conversation, and we'll talk for about 25 to 30 minutes about some of the key questions that might be on your mind about what this exceptional moment in history means in terms of how we are going to approach our infrastructure spending and our infrastructure building, and therefore our nation building. Now, we're going to have a Q&A after that discussion, and you'll notice that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom. Just fill up that Q&A with your questions. I'm going to have a discussion with both of our panelists, and then we'll turn to your questions. I will be looking at them directly and culling from those questions some further topics of exploration for the second later part of this discussion. Now, what we'd also like to do before we hop into the conversation is hear a little bit more from you so that we can frame our discussion. We can be responsive in our discussion, both to where you are in the country and also to what your interests are. So we're popping up a poll. You can see it in front of you on the screen. Please tell us, where are you joining from in our great country or abroad? We know about 10% of our registrants are actually from America. So welcome to our American cousins. We're thrilled that you're joining us today. So pop in here where it is that you are from. I'm doing it now, and submit. And then a second poll question will come up, which is what you're most interested in hearing about. And in that question, what we're really looking at is some themes around where we ought to focus in our conversation. So fill in the polls, and momentarily we'll see the results popping up on the screen. You'll see in the 4 questions that one of the things that we're wondering about is how much money is released is a priority. What we're spending on is a priority. How we're funding infrastructure is a priority. So you can go ahead and just fill out that poll. I think the second question should be popping up momentarily if it's not up there already. So where are you joining from? Not surprisingly, we've got lots of folks from Ontario who have joined our conversation. Welcome to our friends in Atlantic Canada and Quebec as well. We have representation almost from across the country. We're going to have to get more participants from the territories moving forward in the future, but great also to see some international participants. Now we'll close that poll, and now we'll see the second poll, which is really around the themes of our conversation, and that should be popping up on your screen momentarily. I don't see it. I don't know if the others see it. If you don't see it, I think what we'll do is we'll just move on from that second polling question. But essentially, as we move forward and explore things like, what kind of a role does energy efficiency and pursuing energy efficiency in our buildings in how we address infrastructure spending? Of course, big questions around transit and the opportunity for addressing the deficit in our transit infrastructure. We already have the Disaster Mitigation Fund, which is well over allocated, and there's an opportunity to look at shovel-ready projects on that list and how they might be prioritized in moving forward. So what I'd like to do to kick off the panel discussion is to begin with Minister McKenna, and I'm going to be asking both Mr. McKenna and Mr. Sabia the same first question, and it's this, starting at the top. What is your vision for infrastructure and the role that infrastructure can play in both recovery, but also in the long-term thriving of our nation? Minister McKenna, we'll begin with you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. And I should say I did see the polling numbers. So if anyone's wondering, 74% green stimulus, they want to talk about that. After that, it's COVID-19 recovery and then new funding models. So good news, we're going to be talking about those. So look, I mean, infrastructure, if we go to pre-COVID times, which I think is very hard sometimes to remember, infrastructure, it was spoken actually at the very beginning of our mandate. There was a economic panel that was led by Dominic Barton, and he talked about how in an aging society, the 2 ways you grow GDP are immigration or infrastructure, and infrastructure. And so infrastructure has a hugely important role. Certainly, you know, when you think about the situation we're in, we have a health pandemic, we also have an economic crisis. It is extremely important. I mean, I think we need to manage expectations that yes, it creates jobs. It's not always immediate jobs, but you can do what I've called shovel-worthy projects. I think we need to be making sure that we're really focused on what we're investing in. And then, of course, every dollar, and maybe because I'm a mom, every dollar has to be stretched as far as it can, and there are multiple purposes. So certainly, we've committed to net zero by 2050. We absolutely need to be making sure our infrastructure investments are going to get us there. And I think that there's been a lot of focus now. We can't be a one-trick pony on these things, on inclusivity. That we need to be thinking right now. There's a lot of focus on Black Lives Matter, on the fact that we have an infrastructure deficit with our Indigenous communities. It's not just what we built, it's where we built and who's building these projects. And I also like thinking about, are we using Canadian suppliers, Canadian technology, Canadian products? So look, I think that infrastructure is hugely important. And it's interesting because when I moved into this position, a lot of people said, are you really sad, you're not going to be working on climate change. And I think that's like the most hilarious thing. I said, no, actually, we all across government are working on how do we move to a clean economy. And now I have money, so it's even better. And I also get to work with great people like Michael Sabia from the Canada Infrastructure Bank.
Great, thank you very much. With respect to the vision, I think you touched on almost everything there, from resilience to inclusion. We'll begin in our conversation talking about moving the needle on low carbon communities. But first, let's hear from Mr. Sabia. Tell me, what's your vision for infrastructure and the role that infrastructure can play in nation building?
Well, I think about infrastructure right now as a tremendous opportunity and a really powerful lever for, I guess, retooling or repositioning the Canadian economy for the future. I think infrastructure, both in the long term and in the short term and in the long term, can make the country more prosperous by, in effect, updating our economy for the kind of economy, the intangibles economy that we will all be part of in the future. So prosperity, I think, is an important part of it. But similarly, you know, infrastructure is the thing that basically connects people to jobs. It's the thing that connects people to economic opportunity. So I also think infrastructure has a role to play in the sharing of the benefits of growth. It's more than just infrastructure is not about paving roads. Infrastructure is about the circulatory system of an economy, because that's really what infrastructure is. So the more we can do of that, the more creative we can be about that, the more people we can include in that. That just seems to me it's going to build a stronger economy for the future. So that means, you know, I hope we'll have a chance to talk about this stuff, but you know, that means being focused on climate. It means being focused on broadband connectivity. It means opening the aperture a little bit about how we think about infrastructure. It's not just, as I say, roads and bridges or ports, but it's also, you know, big scale irrigation systems that strengthen Canadian agriculture, that improve food security. It's also things like investing in data platforms, which are going to be increasingly and super important in the future in the world of 5G and the Internet of Things. So infrastructure involves, you know, thinking creatively, repositioning the economy, building prosperity, and creating opportunities for people to share in the benefits of that.
So both of you have made it pretty clear that you take a very broad lens of, you know, paving roads is out. That was the old model of infrastructure spending. We also know that in light of COVID-19, that there has been a disproportionate impact on joblessness on women. And historically, when we talk about infrastructure spending, often we're talking about jobs that are you know, their workforce housing that are geared more to male professions, to the male workforce, to male skilled labor. And I think that if we're going to talk about inclusion, when we talk about infrastructure spending, there's kind of two parts to it. On one, there's the types of jobs that are created through the infrastructure spending. And then the other piece is that piece that you raised, Mr. Sabia, which is that the infrastructure actually connects people and jobs. It's who benefits from the infrastructure. I'm wondering if both of you can kind of touch on what is so unique about COVID-19 recovery in relation to past recoveries, precisely because we know that women have been disproportionately impacted in terms of joblessness.
Well, so this is something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, but also reaching out to a lot of economists who are talking about this being a she session. And I think, like, when you have events like this that happen, of course you need to take lessons from the past. So you'll be glad to know I'm reading all about FTR and also what we did you know, under Obama, but also under the Harper government, lessons in the 2012 recession. But you also need to reflect on this is a completely different circumstance. And when you look about who's been impacted, so you're right, disproportionately women, but also visible minorities, other groups that are working in lower income jobs where there's less stability. We've also seen other vulnerabilities. Now, when when you're talking about access to high-speed broadband, that's not just a productivity issue, which of course it is. And there's all great arguments to do it just on a productivity case, but it's an equity issue. That's like whether you can homeschool your kids. I have 3 kids. I can't even imagine. I mean, it's already very challenging to do. But if you don't have access to high-speed broadband, you look at our social infrastructure, and that's part of this as well. I mean, we've seen real vulnerabilities in our social infrastructure. So I think, we need to you need to adapt. And that's one of the things I've learned in government. Sometimes it's extremely hard to tack. You're like, okay, this is all what we're doing. We planned on doing this. We got to go do this. No. And I think there are a lot of good lessons. And I think that, maybe FDR's is like, be brave, focus on people, create jobs, but also do really big things. The Obama administration was, yes, there's an immediate recession, but you have to plan and do brave things for the cleaner economy. And I think here we also need to bring in the social side. We need to think about, as I say, where we're building. I'm having some serious reflections. I've been working with our chief statistician to look at where are the investments actually going. Because there are some communities who are not equally getting the investments that they need for everyone to succeed. And the one thing, life is strange. So, these things, it's obviously a terrible situation, extremely challenging, but you have a little bit more time to reflect. And my title is Minister of Infrastructure, but it's also Minister of Communities. And I don't think I appreciated communities as much, but now everything is local. Like you literally can't go anywhere. And we were stuck in our local communities. And I think you have a greater appreciation for so much, but including nature. And so that's why we've been looking at, we have a new COVID stream that takes existing dollars. As I say, I try to also be mindful of taxpayer dollars and get benefits, adapting that where we would pay a higher split, the federal government. So this is for, we have a $33 billion infrastructure plan with provinces. This would be 10% of that. So we're talking about over $3 billion, and allow for things like, more active transportation, allow for pandemic response. We're going to have to adapt, facilities in result of COVID. So I think it's really important. And then, just in the longer term, the vulnerabilities that were always there are exacerbated. And I think we really need to focus on that because that impacts on our productivity. I think sometimes we take a very narrow view of productivity. But if we don't make these investments, people don't have a chance to succeed. And there's obviously a quality of life issue. But this is why I think infrastructure is so interesting, because I think Michael's point is really great. When you say infrastructure, it's like a made up bureaucratic word and people are like, I guess they mean roads and bridges. But it's actually what's around us. It's how we live our life. It's what enables us to, yes, grow our GDP, create jobs, but also have the quality of life that we want, also build the cleaner future we want. And so that is something that I'm trying to take a broader view, and as a government, we're trying to do that, to really focus on what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to get out of this? And how do we, of course, make sure that these investments, which either reduce emissions or increase emissions, which either make us more resilient or less resilient, that we're making the right decisions in a very focused, targeted way.
So let me pick up on that theme of making the right decisions. And you talked about different epochs in history as having different approaches. This moment is going to need its own approach. We know that 74% of our listeners identified green stimulus funding as being a priority and something that they would really like us to focus on in this conversation. So this is a question for Mr. Sabia around how we can actually use this moment to really move the needle on low carbon communities and economies, and really what the very specific things that you see the Canadian Infrastructure Bank can do to play a role in green infrastructure specifically and advancing green infrastructure. Minister McKenna said, talked about sometimes we need to do really brave things. I'm curious, what would a very brave action on the part of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank look like in this moment that was very specific and targeted to advancing low carbon communities across Canada?
Yeah, look, I think I mean, inside the darkest cloud, there's always some silver lining somewhere. And this is a pretty dark cloud we're all living through, both from a health point of view and certainly from an economic point of view. But, you know, there is some silver lining. And the silver lining is that, you know, this crisis is causing all of us to think differently, I think to think bigger, to be willing to take on bigger challenges, to step up to things in a way that we probably should have been stepping up to climate change before. Hopefully now we can use this as a springboard to do that. But the general point being, and one of the positive things that's happened here is, you know, we've thrown a lot of standard operating procedures out the window, and that's a good thing, because standard operating procedures are generally the enemy of creativity. They're sort of the prisoner of the prison of the imagination. So the fact that they're gone, that's a good thing. So to be more specific and granular in answer to your question, I mean, the way the bank thinks about this is, you know, we have some immediate challenges in front of us, and we do think that the bank can play a quite constructive role in contributing to the relaunching of our economy, to get our economy moving again. But what's important here is that we also think about the relaunching of our economy in the right directions, because it's not just about, you know, as Catherine was saying, it's not just about paving a road. It's about seizing on this moment to say, well, we can create jobs and we can stimulate economic activity by being more aggressive in how we support and incentivize the creation of renewable power, to accelerate the transition across the country in terms of the sources of our power. We can use this as an opportunity to create cleaner commutes, zero emission buses, more electrified transit. You know, we can do all of those things. So there's an opportunity here to push us along a path that we need to go down in any event, and to seize the moment to go down that path faster, so that we can address, you know, the urgent issues of climate change. So, my point here is, in the face of this crisis, use infrastructure to propel the economy in a positive direction, to accelerate going down the path that we had to go down anyway, and do it. And climate change is clearly one of the most important and one of the biggest opportunities. So the bank, you know, wants to be very present with substantial allocations of capital to help move us along and down that path.
So excellent to hear. You're talking about a lot of things that are about decarbonizing our cities and our communities, things like electric buses, renewable energy. The one thing that you didn't say, which I'll add just because I wouldn't be me if I didn't, which is the opportunity to build out cycling infrastructure in our cities, which is one of the most sustainable forms of transportation that can be expedited very quickly. But the 20 largest municipalities in Canada have 100 kilometers of cycling lanes that they've planned that are currently unfunded. A challenge with that is that that's a model that generates a return to society, but there's no financial model for building that. So I think this question of what does a sustainable finance lens look like when we bring it to infrastructure projects, because sometimes the things that have the lowest impact actually don't fit with traditional models of how we evaluate what project we're going to pursue. I'm wondering if you could stick
with your point, but stick with your point, which is really important, about cities. You know, cities play a really important role, as you all know, in how our economy works today, particularly in an intangibles, knowledge-based economy. Cities are critical motors, critical engines of economic prosperity. That being said, they're also a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. So on your point about cities, yes, I hear your point about cycling, but similarly, there's another, not a but and, I should say. One of the other areas that the bank's very interested in is what can we do to substantially accelerate building retrofits? How can we address the magnitude of emissions that comes from cities? How can we clean this up? How can we create financial incentives to lever in private capital to greatly accelerate that process? So it's another example of let's go where we have to go anywhere, but let's go there faster.
Maybe I could just make a point. So first of all, I think it's very important, Jennifer, everyone should know, one, we do fund active transportation. In fact, we broadened green infrastructure to allow for active transportation. And in our COVID stream, it will fund to the extent, I mean, the thing is we've allowed provinces and municipalities to work together to provide us with the projects, but it would fund active transportation. But I think the really important point, like in the role of the bank, let's be clear about the bank. I mean, it's to crowd in private sector capital. So some things will be suitable and some things will be maybe less suitable. But what's great is that we are able to work together with the bank on these really big priorities. So I bet you most people on this Zoom call know what the big areas we need to reduce emissions. We have to retrofit everything. We have these buildings that are, and homes that are not at all energy efficient. We need much better public transportation, linked, of course, to active transportation, because if people can't get to the public transportation, often it's in Ottawa, 70% of people, I think, will live within 5 kilometers. How are we getting them those 5 kilometers to the transportation? Interties, major transmission lines between provinces. We're so lucky to have clean power, but how are we making sure that we're getting off coal faster? Because we want to electrify everything. Then you get to electric buses and our transportation sector. So I think that the really great opportunity, and I mean, I think you could go sector by sector, but I think you can also just say the big opportunity now is that you have a government that is committed to net zero by 2050, and you have other partners from cities and provinces to the private sector that we can actually make the investments, because they're very significant investments, but the return on investment is just so huge, including a sustainable future for our kids. So that, I think, is the big thing. It may seem less sexier because it's not piece by piece. We will do piece by piece, but it's just this coming together, recognizing that infrastructure is so key to it, and then really figuring out what are all the levers so that we can do more infrastructure as opposed to less infrastructure, and the right kind of infrastructure.
So we've been talking about the right kinds of projects, and I think that's actually a big shift in the conversation around infrastructure, is recognizing that spending on anything isn't desirable, and really strategic, that we're investing in the right types of projects that advance a low carbon future. Let's shift a little bit and talk about the mechanisms for how the money might flow on these projects. And there's two kind of parts to this question. Mr. Sabia highlighted the fact that we're in a moment where we're throwing out old processes in terms of how we approach getting things done. CERB was a perfect example of that. The government acted very quickly and executed a just-in-time initiative that, quite frankly, kept many Canadians feeding their families. And if we had gone to traditional models of doing that, that wouldn't have happened. And so the same kind of moment we find ourselves in with infrastructure, that we need new kinds of mechanisms for how we are going to deliver infrastructure funding, or we'll miss the moment where we need that infrastructure funding to be acting as a stimulus and acting as part of our job recovery program. So my question is about what are the mechanisms to get the money flowing? For example, the Green Municipal Fund historically has been a mechanism to fund and to flow monies to municipalities. What kind of a role will that play in the recovery process? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is recognizing that municipalities are back on their heels right now. Municipalities, like the City of Toronto, have a problem to the tune of $1 billion. Thinking about investing in capital projects is the first thing that comes off the table when you've got a shortfall at the municipal level. And at the same time, it's those same municipalities that we want not to let up on spending on capital projects. How do you kind of get around that contradiction that the municipalities are asking for operating dollars, not money for capital projects. They like can't even get their head around that because they're trying to keep the lights on. So I'm wondering if you can address these two questions of how do you flow the money, and how do you also deal with this problem that one of your key partners, which is municipalities, they're so back on their heels that it shouldn't surprise us if they can't even consider capital projects at this moment in time. And to either one of you, maybe Minister McKenna first.
So I'll start with the municipalities piece, because of course it's a very challenging situation for municipalities. We did something, we flowed the gas tax, the two installments at once, which did help. I obviously I care greatly about this because public transit is so critically important, and it's been really hit hard in terms of revenues from public transit, and also ridership. And we need people to want to take public transit because it helps them get around faster, cleaner, cheaper, and we are making historic investments. You'll be glad to know that Minister Freeland is working extremely hard on the Safe Restart Agreement with the provinces, which does include, looking at how do we support municipalities from an operating expense, because as you say, we want them to be investing in capital. Free-flowing gas tax money actually has helped some municipalities so that they can invest. They've said that they will be able to continue their capital investments because they had a cash flow issue, but that's pretty technical. I mean, they need obviously more funds to support them. With the COVID stream, we did recognize this. This is a stream that would be for smaller projects, a lower split. The federal government would pay more. So that's also a recognition that we need to do this. Getting to mechanisms. So I guess I'm kind of a nerd now because I really care about this. Because it's really great to have goals, and we have ambitious goals, and I'm very proud of the climate plan that we negotiated over a year, and all the other things that we have added to it in terms of commitments and targets. But you only get there by making sure that you actually have programs that are going to deliver the outcomes. And I've seen some weaknesses in how we do our programs. So I think that there are huge opportunities. I think one, municipalities are key. So we do have some programs where we work directly with municipalities. You talked about the Green Municipal Fund. We actually invested $1 billion to help with retrofits of community buildings. We have our disaster mitigation adaptation fund, which you mentioned, which we do. I'm very focused on how we replenish this. It includes natural infrastructure, critically important, but that is also accessible directly by municipalities and Indigenous peoples. So I think we need to be practical. We do have our bilateral agreements with provinces. And it just so everyone knows, so it's not like we're starting from scratch here, because sometimes when you have these conversations, like, what have I been doing? All I've been doing beyond, working with Michael on the Canada Infrastructure Bank, beyond looking at a national infrastructure assessment. So we are really focused on what outcomes we want to get and aligning what we're doing. I've been working on getting hundreds of projects approved so that we can actually get construction going immediately. And that's in the areas of public transit. That's in the areas of green infrastructure. So we've got amazing renewable projects, including one in Summerside, PEI, that everyone should read up about. Tuktayuktuk, we just invested they obviously have a huge coastal erosion issue, electric buses across the country. So already doing good things, but I think looking at the future, how do we align our long-term goals with the investments we're making now? And so I mentioned this national infrastructure assessment. The UK has this model, Australia, New Zealand, where they really say, okay, where do we want to be 30 years out? And what are the biggest challenges and opportunities? And how do we line that up with what we want to do? And then what are the programs that will get us there? And I think that is important, because lofty goals are great, but if you can't deliver on them, you don't have a practical way to do it, then it's not going to be that helpful. And I mean, as I say, you have different tools. I think the bank is also a really great tool because there's a lot of private sector capital out there, and we have great pension funds, but where are they investing in infrastructure? Often in other countries. So I think that we need to look at different models. Not everything will be suitable, for a particular model, but I think there's huge opportunities.
So let's maybe close with a follow-up question to Mr. Sabia about that, which comes through the question thread from Natalia. and we've had quite a bit of conversation about mitigating disaster, and there's the disaster relief fund, which is way oversubscribed. Is there a role specifically for the Canadian Infrastructure Bank in financing disaster risk projects? Is that something that you also see as being part of your purview in this moment specifically?
First, when you use the phrase disaster risk projects, help me define that for me.
So flood mitigation, for example, there's a oversubscription of really shovel-ready projects to mitigate flooding in areas of the country where flooding is having onerous impacts on existing communities.
Yeah. So as Catherine alluded to, an important element of what the bank does is the bank fundamentally is not in the grant business or the subsidy business, because that falls more in the purview of either the government of Canada or provincial governments. So our role is to work in circumstances where there is some potential flow of revenue, be they payments made by governments, be they some kind of other flow of revenue, such as, for example, someone gets on a commuter transit facility, whether it's a bus or a train or whatever, and they have a transit pass that they've paid for, some kind of revenue model. That can take many different forms, but that's really the sweet spot of what we can do. So my answer to the question is, conceivably, yes, we can do those things. Actually managing water and managing irrigation systems, which flows into and is pretty closely connected to the point for your example about flood management. Because managing water systems is something that actually I think the bank can be involved in, so long as we establish some kind of revenue stream between us and, in this case, for instance, a provincial government. So you know, my answer is yes, but it depends a bit on circumstances, and it depends a bit on what the local government is interested and willing to do in terms of creating a revenue model, so that the bank at least gets its capital back. It's not necessarily about earning a return, it's about getting its capital back. More broadly, around this issue of the role of the bank, you know, the bank can create circumstances where things that would not happen happen. I'll give you an example. We talked about the situation of municipal governments, really important issue. But there, you know, we can do things. We're a very long-term focused institution. So if we can do things to lower the upfront costs of, say, climate-friendly technologies or climate-friendly transit, because down the road, there's a stream of savings, of operating savings associated with those things. The bank can structure things in such a way that we can lower those upfront costs and therefore reduce the financial burden on a municipality by using the savings over time to, in effect, pay ourselves back for the capital that we use up front. Now, that's just one example of how the bank can play a creative role in changing the financial calculus in front of a municipal government or a province, or for that matter, the national government. There are lots of other examples of things that we can demonstrate that they work. And by demonstrating that they work, we kind of take that first level of risk away. And then that allows, Catherine alluded to this, that allows, for instance, Canadian pension funds to come in as a source, a big source, and a very expert source of capital to help finance those things. Just a couple of examples of the kind of, if you open your mind a little bit about how we can finance infrastructure in Canada, really there's an enormous opportunity here to lever these big pools of capital that exist in the world to help us step up to this infrastructure opportunity that we have. And the role of the bank fundamentally is to act as a catalyst to make that happen.
So in our last couple of minutes, I'd like to pick up on those comments about the role of the bank and link it together with the comments that Minister McKenna made about the role of transit, electric buses, large-scale transit infrastructure projects. We're at a moment in history where we've seen a fundamental upending of our model of funding operations of transit in the Canadian context, because in comparison to our counterparts around the world, we have relied heavily on the fare box to fund operations. What we've learned during COVID is that in a crisis such as this, running transit, particularly for our essential workers, is absolutely critical. But we're not going to have enough people putting a coin in the fare box, metaphorically, to cover operations. But we still need to run the train because our nurses, our cashiers are using transit to keep all of society running. So it seems to me that it becomes even less viable following what we've just gone through and the crisis of the operating model of transit in the Canadian context, that you're going to be able to create a model where there's some kind of return for building transit infrastructure, because transit infrastructure actually requires government money. We need to treat it a bit more like we treat healthcare. We see that there's an overall societal benefit, the air we breathe, the types of communities that we create, the social equity that we build in our cities by providing access to safe, efficient, and reliable transit. How do you kind of square that challenge that has become, it's magnified in the context of COVID?
Well, Michael probably has a very good example. I mean, Michael has worked on one of the the big projects of the bank, the REM project in Montreal, which is a great infrastructure project, and they've actually been able to use the bank as well as government funding. I mean, the only thing I'll say is, look, I hear you on this. It is really important, and however things are funded, I mean, we need to make sure that we are, I've always said it, that public transit is important because it's clean, because it gets people around faster, and it also gets people around in more affordable ways. A lot of people can't afford to have a car. I mean, and then there's all the young people who don't even want to have a car. So we need to make sure that it is properly funded, and that we're also building it. And that finally in Montreal, like the metro line that, we're building, metro stop, like it's actually going to be the first time there's been a new metro stop, that's being built. So we are making these historic investments, but I think it'd be interesting for folks, because I don't know if everyone knows about the REM project, Michael. Maybe you can say a little bit about that, because people might be surprised that the bank had a role in a public transit project.
Michael, we're just running out of time here. If you can give us a very quick snapshot, I apologize. I didn't manage our time very well. A very quick snapshot of how that worked, and then I'll pass over the mic to Elizabeth to wrap up.
Sure. Well, look, I'll be very quick. That project, which is 67 kilometers of transit that connects the South Shore to the island of Montreal, to the North Shore, and to the west of the island. It's the biggest transit project in Montreal in about 50 or 60 years. What's, I guess, important about it is that it has brought together institutional capital coming from La Caisse de Dépôt and capital coming from the Government of Canada and the Government of Quebec in a very different model as to how to get things done. And because, to come back to my comment about throwing standard operating procedures out the window, that's basically what it did. And we were able to do at much lower cost than anyone thought a project of that magnitude. It's going to pay CDPQ, that case, a modest return over a very long period of time. So for a very long-term investor, it's a good investment. And it has the support of two levels of government who were able to accomplish something because of CDPQ's presence that they would not otherwise have been able to afford to do. So that's an idea. It's another way of accomplishing infrastructure in Canada. And it's another way in which I think the infrastructure bank can act as a catalyst to bring in other sources of institutional capital to get things done at lower costs to government. Because let's be honest, whether it's the national government, provincial government, or municipalities, as you've said, they're all going to be constrained. But we've got to build this infrastructure, and we've got to build climate-friendly infrastructure. So the question is, how can we get it done in a way that's good for pension funds who manage people's pensions over time? And how do we get it done that it's good for the taxpayer? That's the challenge, and I think the bank can play a role in bringing those various parties together to deliver what the country needs.
Fabulous. We didn't get a chance to talk about infrastructure costs, so not the financing, but how we deliver at a lower cost. But I would direct our listeners to an excellent report that was undertaken by the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario that looks at why it costs so much in the Canadian context to build infrastructure and gets at some of the challenges in the delivery process that I think are important for us to be aware of at this point in time. Thank you, Minister McKenna. Thank you to Mr. Sabia. This has been a rich discussion. I trust that all of our panelists have enjoyed and have found inspiration in the conversation. And Elizabeth, I pass the mic back to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Minister Michael. It's been great to hear that insightful dialogue. What a pleasure. Perspectives, of course, from Minister McKenna and Michael and the chairs that you sit in, and Jennifer, your expertise and experience. I think we all could have listened for a lot longer than 45 minutes. So I think you wove that dialogue together just expertly. So thank you so much. In case anybody on the line missed any portion of the conversation, we will share a recording of the event by email shortly. So, and that will include some key takeaways from the discussion. In that email, we'll also be sharing some of the questions from the chat that we weren't able to get to. As you know, Globe works with partners to convene a wide variety of virtual events and experiences. And next up, Globe is supporting Emissions Reduction Alberta on delivering their Maximizing Funding Potential workshop next week. This event is going to provide information on government funding sources for clean tech, and the response to date for that event has been overwhelming. We've actually increased capacity in order to meet demand. So if you'd like to participate, you can check out that link on the screen to hear more. Next month in August, Globe Virtual will co-host a webinar with the Social Purpose Institute and Junction Strategy on social purpose. And we'll touch on some of the outcomes from the Globe Advance back in February, including highlights from the Advance Session report that was released earlier this week, which you can find on the Globe website and through social media. So you can stay tuned for more information on that upcoming session. I also want to remind everyone that Globe provides advisory services on all aspects of convening virtual and in-person engagements at a time when I think we're all feeling the lack of connection, but need it more than ever to advance and accelerate positive change. We do want to help you connect the right people to capital and solutions. So please reach out and let us know how you can help. And of course, continue to share your feedback on topics and themes that you'd like to hear more about by email. On that note, thank you everyone for being with us this afternoon or this morning, depending where you're joining from, and have a great rest of your day. Stay safe and stay well.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.